I feel very honored, to be here, to share with you our own experiences in Swaziland. Thank you for the kind words of introduction. I think sometimes people tend to exaggerate who I am. I'm not all that you said. But I'm happy to be here to speak with you about Swaziland. Obviously, I'm inspired as someone who, from Egypt, was been inspired by the Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions recently, given that the regimes in these two countries, have been for a long time, not different from our Swazi regime in terms of dictatorship, the denial of human rights and the rule of law and good governance. So we find ourselves in the same struggle as the Tunisians and the Egyptians. And of course, in the same struggle as all people everywhere, fighting for freedom and dignity. So I'm really happy to be here. I think let me begin from where we are right now in Swaziland, and then we can go back to how it gets to be in this difficult situation. I'm sure that if anybody could go to the website now and Google events in Swaziland, you'll discover that given the uprising that started today, April 12th, government has been in a panicking mode, so they say, and we follow events that most of the leaders of the democracy movement have been arrested. At least 7 have been identified, have been taken as of last night in Swaziland. We're not sure where they are right now, but we know that they've been taken in by the members of the security forces. The police have been told by the government to round everybody up who is seen to be, a ringleader or an agitator. You understand what I mean? The people in the forefront must be removed to sort of make sure that the ground does not swell for further support. But despite that leadership has been removed, from the forefront, people continue to demand that the regime must go. In the same manner as it was said with Ben Ali in Tunisia and Mubarak in Egypt. So that's the main demand. People are saying, look, it's time for change, it's time for democracy, it's time for a new era. But often with dictators, you don't get that. Biblically, they say that you ask for a bread, you get a snake or a stone. When you ask for fish, you get a snake. When you ask for bread, you get a stone. I think it's been common in our continent that when people ask for bread, they get a stone. When they ask for fish, they get a snake. So I think government said, we're going to give you a snake instead of fish. We're going to arrest all of you. We learned that over 100 members of the democracy movement were wounded up in some place and dumped into some forest around my area. I come from an area where there's a lot of man-made plantations for the pulp industry. So people have been dumped somewhere in the bush so that they could not be part of the demonstrations. So the environment on the ground is very hostile for any form of activity. But we are hopeful that despite the resistance, and the hostility by the government, the struggle is not going to be crushed. People are going to continue to demanding for change. That is where we are right now. This demonstration has been scheduled for today, tomorrow, up to the 14th. So 3 days at least. But it may go beyond that, given the reaction that the government has decided to engage in response to people's demands. I think the background to that is that, being here in Canada, I'm inspired to say that maybe we are one people, given that we belong to the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth has agreed on certain basic fundamentals, and governments have committed to respect those. 1991, they agreed on the Commonwealth Declaration, and they said that they are going to respect the rights of the people. They're going to guarantee multi-party democracy, human rights, rule of law, to ensure that the dignity of the people is actually respected in terms of the laws. But what is on paper, we all know, is not the practice. People everywhere say that you need to be true to what you say on paper. We're holding you accountable for what you have promised us. And that's the inspiration that people have actually used to demand change in Swaziland. Because in 1973, April 12th, which is very fundamental, the then king, His Majesty King Sobhuza, the father of the current king, repealed what was called the Independence Constitution, which guaranteed fundamental rights and freedoms, created the government, and sort of created the rule of law, separating the executive from the parliament and the judiciary. The king said, no, that's not good for Swaziland. We've got our own system, we're a kingdom, and therefore I will assume all powers of state. He became a supreme ruler. From then on, people have been denied fundamental rights. They don't form a government, they don't elect, the prime minister. The king appoints the prime minister, and together they appoint the cabinet. The king appoints, members of the judiciary. Even though people are allowed to elect some form of parliament, the king manipulates that by appointing 20 members in the upper house. It's a two-chamber parliament. He appoints 20 members in the upper house and 10 members in the lower house. So we've got a sort of a weak parliamentary system. So you don't have the guarantees of freedoms and good governance. I think the fundamental departure from that happened in 1983. When people came together to say, look, we cannot allow the situation to continue where just a clique in the form of the monarchy manipulates the people, using custom and culture and tradition, and forcing people to, live by those, prescribed traditions. A group was formed called Kudemo, the People United Democratic Movement, which has remained the voice of conscience for Swaziland, demanding that the country must return to a multi-party constitutional state. 1990, the members of that group were wound up again by the state charged under high treason. The High Court convicted them. The Supreme Court, acquitted them on the main offense of high treason, but found them guilty of convening a political meeting. 1996, the king started a process under pressure, to say he's prepared to, expand people's rights to allow them to participate in the formation of government. That resulted in 2005 in the adoption of a constitution, some form of a constitution, guaranteeing a Bill of Rights under Chapter 3, and saying that people can elect directly members of parliament. But the essence of that is that whilst we had this constitution, the monarchy remained the supreme authority in Swaziland. And the democracy movement said, we have not been part of the process, and therefore don't accept this document as a supreme law of the country, because it doesn't depart from the past. It is meant to entrench the dictatorship, and therefore we can't accept it. In response, I will often say that with the Bush administration on the war on terror, as we know that after September 11 in the US, government said, look, we're going to fight terrorism. And anybody who was seen to be dissenting from the mainstream form of government, would be tempted and labeled as a terrorist. And Kudemo was labeled as a terrorist group in 2008, after the government enacted a law to fight the terrorism, as it were. And Mario Masu, who has been the leader, was arrested and charged under terrorism and sedition. I followed him in 2009, as my colleague has said that I was arrested in 2009 because there's been events where people were planting some bombs, almost like the South African ANC struggle days, petrol bombs all over the country. And 2 colleagues were blown off by a bomb under one of the king's speech. And then I said, look, it is my view that this would not have happened if government had agreed to talk to the other side. And if anybody should be held responsible for the death of these colleagues in the bomb, it should be the government. Because if you close up all channels of communication, people will say, look, we're going to find some space to express ourselves. And violence, perhaps, there's been none of those in Africa. It's been common. In South Africa, for us, in Swaziland, it's been a very clear case study that when you close all forms of communication, people are going to engage in some form of action where they can get attention. That's how I got to be charged under the Act. Obviously, with that environment, which is very hostile, and I'm sure you can see that is very similar to Tunisia and Egypt in terms of repression. Denying people the right to express themselves politically, making sure that the media is not free to report on the people's demands and grievances, suppressing all forms of political activity in Swaziland. That is the reason why people today, following from your experience in Egypt, using Facebook and all these gadgets, agreed to say we are going to engage in an uprising. It is called the April 12th uprising. That's why it started today. And I started by saying that already people have been taken in. That's where we are. In summary, so we can engage in some kind of dialogue. Let me say that I have said that the main demand is that people are saying this government must go. Obviously, if the king were to accept that demand, it would mean that the country is to begin in a process of negotiating a process that will lead to a democratic dispensation. I'm happy to say that that has been the main, call that the country can move forward through a peaceful negotiated settlement. And Podemos, as the main political party, has consistently maintained that position. So if the king were to agree to disband this government, the next step would be to agree on an interim government. And people on the ground are saying, look, remove this government, let's create an interim government. And then we convene an assembly of delegates to represent all segments of society. And we agree on a time frame, whether 2 years or 3 years. South Africa took about 4 years to negotiate a new constitution. Once we agree on a democratic constitution, we can then say, let's have an election, multi-party based election, where people's government will be formed. Obviously, many Swazis are not in the country right now, or they've been forced out by harassment and intimidation and torture, all forms of, hostility against them, and are in exile. My colleagues can confirm that others are in England, London, others in Australia, but many of them are in South Africa. It is part of the demand that you must allow them to come back into the country unconditionally, so they can be part of the process. You can't negotiate a transition without people being involved. So that's the main demand. Obviously, all the laws which are there, I've mentioned the Terrorism Act, the Sedition Act, all those laws, people are saying they must be removed, so that the environment is conducive for effective people's participation. And I think that's where we are as a people. So people are saying that until those demands are met, by the king and his, we often say his cabals, they will continue to go on the streets, despite harassment, despite arrest, despite torture. They will insist that the government must go. I think let me end there for now, and then we can, engage in some dialogue, and then I'll respond to some other concerns. But if you've got anything to add, Teresa and I think we must do so.
I would really, you missed, but we gave a round robin of who was here. Alors, j'aimerais présenter les trois qui sont arrivés là.
Tiffany Murray, I'm in the municipal and the representation section. I'm a grievance and adjudication officer.
Patricia Harewood, I'm a grievance and adjudication officer of representation here, and I'm also a member of the Alfie Institute. One of the sponsors of the event.
Eugene Amboli, I'm with the Regional Council of the National Capital Region.
So now I think we could open it up for discussion with Thulani, and I'll try my best to keep a speakers list as we go.
Maybe, Thulani, do you want to just say a few words about the unions in Swaziland and a bit of the structure and their involvement specifically and stuff going on now.
And how they were banned as well in 1973, not only political parties.
Yeah, I think it's a crucial point because with the ban on political activity, it has been the labor unions, which have been used as a vehicle for change in Swaziland. There are three main labor unions in Swaziland: the Swaziland Federation of Trade Unions (SFTU), Swaziland Federation of Labour (SFL), and then the Teachers Union, Swaziland National Association of Teachers (SNAT). Those are the three leading labor movements in Swaziland. They also are part of the broader democracy movement. They have agreed that they must continue to work together to push for change. In that regard, they work together under a structure which they term the LCC. LCC is a Labor Coordinating Council. The intention is to eventually, transform the three movements into one big federation. The name that's being touted for now is something like the Congress of Swaziland Federations, something like that. We're hoping that not very long from now, we're going to see one big federation in Swaziland, so that areas of minimize some form of division, because we know that governments have a tendency of dividing people so that it becomes easy to govern them. That's meant to sort of minimize events like that. It is appropriate to say that on March 18th, the Federation together engaged in protest actions. It is reported that at least 10,000 people were in the streets to demand that this government must resign. Obviously, they resisted. So this second round of protests is a response to that. Now they're saying that you refuse to resign. We're calling for a multi-party dispensation. But the unions, as I've said, are working together with the political parties, Pudemo and one other, called them One National Liberatory Congress, NNLC, one of the oldest parties in Swaziland. And all of them, with the civil society organizations, belong to a structure, an inclusive structure, called the Swaziland United Democratic Front, SUDF. It is molded, I think most of us who followed South African struggle, it is modeled along the lines of the UDF in South Africa in the 1980s, which was basically led by the ANC. It is appropriate, therefore, to say that the labor movement, political parties, students, civil society are together in this agenda to say enough is enough. And I think it is in that regard that it is also good that myself and my colleagues are here today to speak with you and say that moral support is necessary. Voices of support, from across the world would inspire them to say, look, in these difficult times, they're not alone. Various structures in the world, in the form of unions, in the form of civil society, in whatever form, are welcome to say to the king, it is time, Your Majesty, you speak to your citizens, because right now nobody is saying that the king must be removed altogether from power. People are saying we can have democracy side by side with the monarch. I think it would be because of the response that people are going to say, look, what's the point of having a monarchy in any event if it's not responsive to our needs, and therefore let's just do away with it. There are elements already which are saying that, but I think they are not yet commanding popular support. But I think this process happening today will give indication to what extent people can continue to say that we can live with the monarchy and democracy. Or we go all out and say, look, we can have a country without the monarch so that democracy is entrenched. I think that is the position with regards to the labor movement in Swaziland. So we can begin in the dialogue. Anything more? on the movement side.
Um,
You want me to talk about how they were banned in 73?
Well, just that the fact that they were banned in 73, it wasn't political parties, the unions were banned, and then, I understand, I'm not sure, but over, what happened was the unions had relationship with the ILO, for example, prior to that, so it was through the unions and their previous relationships that they were able to operate when political parties still could not operate.
Yeah. I think the point would be that with the removal of the Bill of Rights in 1973, it basically meant that even labor rights were done away with. Because the law that the king put in place was to the effect that he was banning political parties and similar bodies. And similar bodies included trade unions, you know. But over the years, with the ILO standards and the fact that Swaziland was part of the ILO machinery, they've been forced to allow some form of space to labor unions. And I think they would live to regret that, because it is because of that limited space that we're in this situation today where the labor movement are in the forefront for change in Swaziland. Thank you very much.
I would appreciate if you could give us a bit of, if you could give us some idea of rates of poverty in the country. What is the most important part of the economy, agricultural or industrial? What are the countries that have their hand in Swaziland? I think it's important to situate it, because otherwise we won't understand where we can apply pressure, where we can support you.
I think it is significant to say that the economy of Swaziland is tied with the South African economy. You know, I think the economic problem that we're facing now is because of the diminish of what the country has been benefiting from what is called the SACU. SACU is Southern African Customs Union. You know, it's a pool of revenue where countries within SADC were benefiting from that through the South African economy. And I think because of the economic challenge in the world, it fell very heavily. Yet the big chunk of the country's budget was coming from there. You know, so South Africa is a key partner in the Swazi economy. But obviously there are industries which are British, you know, companies. Conco, one of the biggest employers in Swaziland, is a British US company through Coca-Cola and stuff. And the king, you know, to manipulate the influence that industry would have in the country, created, you know, some kind of a pseudo monarchical company. It's got shares in all these investment companies, 50%, 51%. You know. So they don't have the capacity to influence him, you know, to change, because he commands a lot of influence within those companies. Now, speaking to poverty, you know, it's very high, and IMF was on the ground last month. You know, the poverty is going to obviously escalate, because IMF recommended that about 7,000 public servants must be retrenched. You know, over and above that, they said that there must be 10% cut of salaries. You know, people in Swaziland obviously live below the $1 poverty line. You know. So if you cut 10% from the salaries and you retrench 7,000 or more, when you are escalating poverty, and indeed HIV and AIDS is very high, despite the fact that the US and the UN has continued to pump money into Swaziland in the fight against HIV and poverty, you know. But because of the lack of checks and balances, you know, we doubt whether those resources actually go to benefit the people whom it is meant to do so, because of the lack of mechanisms on the part of government to account. People have complained that whilst you have seen so much money coming in, you know, to fight HIV and poverty, you don't see those things diminishing. And the connection is very simple. If you have a country where you've got a clique of corrupt leaders, they won't use the money for the people. And I think that has been very important because the idea of making people dependent on handouts, has not been sustainable because there's no money anymore, to keep people depending on handouts from government. And people are saying, look, we need a system that will guarantee that people are able to sustain themselves independent of handouts from government. That has escalated the demand for change. I think that is the situation with regard to the economy and poverty and HIV and so on.
So the main industries.
Sugar. Yeah, the main industry is obviously, because the country is an agriculture-based economy. The main industry has been sugar. Until the fall of the pulp industry, it's been sugar and the paper industry. One of the biggest pulp company closed down in 2008, meaning that the mainstream economy therefore dependent on sugar. But I think the sugar industry also had a problem in recent times. So there's been a shrink on the revenue coming from the sugar industry. So those are the serious implications of having an economy based on agriculture. When everything falls in the world economy, on the ground it's even worse. And I was told that some companies in Canada even closed down in the plantations and pulp industry. So that's the devastation that we're facing in Swaziland right now.
And then there's quite a lot of textile factories as well that are, were they mostly Chinese?
We don't often count that as a main investment because Chinese everywhere are known to be abusive and they are more inclined, to supporting the regime than otherwise. And actually, one of the ministers is accused, of being so close to that industry to an extent that it is reported that millions of rands, which ought to have been used to promote that industry, went into the pockets of individuals, including this minister. And I think part of the call has been that people like those would have been the first one to resign from government. But obviously he's got very close links with the king, and despite the people's demand that he has to account for those money, that demand went unheard and he continued to be part of the government institution.
Just to follow up, the African, you were talking about the African palm, is that growing, the African palm?
Palm.
Is that growing? Yeah, palm industry. Did you say there was palm
The pulp.
industry?
Pulp.
Pulp and paper.
Pulp and paper.
Pulp and
Yes.
paper.
Yeah.
Honestly,
Pulp and paper.
Swaziland has the largest,
Yeah.
well, it did have the largest man-made forest in the world. The
Pulp and
paper.
yeah, the western part of the country.
And that's, you're saying that's going down now?
Doesn't-
It's
That's
closed
what that
now.
is. Closed now.
I don't know how many workers were there, 2,000 or 3,000?
More than that, 3,000-4,000 people. Most of because when the company was still big, it was employing people and also contracting out. So there are people employed by the company and having contracts. You've got a wide pool of people employed. Some of them permanent, some of them temporary employees. So it was quite a big sort of employment institution in Swaziland.
And the population of the country?
About 1.2 million. So small.
Before all this economic crisis, the unemployment was about 40%. Like, 2 or 3 years ago when things were good, so who knows now?
Yeah.
And they say it's 60% of the population, the UN says 60% live below the $2 poverty line. And when the IMF called for a 10% cut, the king was given a 13% royal allowance. So his allowance is half, his personal allowance is half of the entire royal family of the UK. But the GDP of Swaziland is 5% of Britain's. So that the ones that are rich, well, the king is supposed to be the second richest in Africa, second richest man in Africa, according to Forbes. So we're talking extremes,
So
right?
I think, Patricia, you had behind
Yeah,
that.
I had a question. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for your presentation. I'm sorry I was a little bit late, so we appreciate you coming. My question was really about solidarity, because you spoke about the unions and the role of the unions in the democratic movement in Swaziland, and my question is more about solidarity from the other African unions. We know that the South African unions traditionally have been, they were very involved in the anti-apartheid movement. Thinking of other unions in Namibia, in Mozambique, whether there have been any, what has been the solidarity like from the other African trade unions? Has there been any?
I think it is fair that the South African labor unions, through COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, that's been very strong. They've been the most vocal, supporters of the Swazi struggle, dating way back. And last year, September, there was a protest inside Swaziland. COSATU sent its members into Swaziland to support. Right now, they have said, we're hearing that at least 3,000 members or more of COSATU will be in the borders of Swaziland to support the struggle inside. COSATU is working together with the South African Communist Party in that process. They're also working together with the African National Congress Youth League, which has got strong connections with the PUDEMO as a political party in Swaziland. In SADC, I think one can say with confidence that it has been COSATU and the CEP and the ANC Youth League which have been very vocal about the Swazi problems. Mozambique, we haven't heard from Mozambique. We haven't heard, there are some voices in Zimbabwe because of the similarity of the problems. And I think recently there are signals that people in Botswana are beginning to support the Swazi struggle. Not in Namibia, I haven't heard anything from Namibia, not in Malawi. So we can count South Africa, Zimbabwe and Botswana for now. And I think more so given this recent clear demand that this government must actually be removed. And I think it is through COSATU that some voices beyond Africa have been watching and have been saying, look, this situation is not sustainable. Therefore, you must accept that it's time to move into a new era in Swaziland. So COSATU has been very supportive of the Swazi struggle. And we are hoping that from this forum, that we obviously further support for the Swazi people. Indeed, it's always easy to keep it union to union, even if the program becomes broader than that. But I think we are hoping that we can begin some kind of collaboration between you and the public service union in Swaziland, and we can see what can unfold in the future.
Just in terms of the public service unions and public servant workers, how big is that service in Swaziland? How many people work?
I may not be sure of the numbers, but numbers from the teachers union have been estimated to be between 10 and 12,000. That's the teachers alone. But we also have got people working with the government, which have a separate union. You've got the teachers union and the public service union. The public servants union affiliate to SFTU, which is a federation. SNAT is in the move of being made part of the bigger federation. But I think it has been said that government is the biggest employer in Swaziland. So you would expect that the number of people involved in the union from the public service is obviously very high. If we're talking about 10,000 being teachers, you expect a bigger number from those who are employed by government in the public service. I'm not sure of the figure because I'm merely involved with them in my capacity, as it were, as a human rights person, not involved in the internal structures. But I know that the number is quite big. And the last protest action on March 18 was actually motivated through the public service. Then the other colleagues joined in there. So there's been the people, at least, who have been in the forefront to call for a change in Swaziland. with the further support from their colleagues.
To what extent are those public service jobs occupied by people who have some loyalty to the existing regime? I assume you're not looking at a politically neutral public service.
I think obviously the top brass, who the king appoints cabinet with the prime minister, and then the king appoints the private and principal secretaries of the public service. You are right, therefore, that you cannot have an independent public service. And I think during the process of crafting the constitution, it was the commission that was appointed to craft the constitution. All the members of about 30 people were appointed by the king. And I think they recommended that, claiming that the people have said so, that people who would be appointed into the public service would be people who are sympathetic to the system, you know. And therefore, if you've got a government composed of people loyal to the king, you can't expect people to divert from that. But a clear example of that is that the structures created by the law, by the constitution, to advise the king on who to appoint in all these bodies, you know, all of them are composed by people appointed by the king. Because your question is directed to the public service, you've got the Public Service Commission. All the members in the Public Service Commission are king's appointees, and therefore they'll appoint people who are loyal to the regime. But that is just a starting point, only for the public service, strictly. You would extend and say, look, let's look at the judiciary. And I think we can all agree that you can't have a country with the rule of law if you don't have an independent judicial system. You will be surprised to learn that the Judicial Service Commission, which advises the king on who to appoint into the judiciary, is created of 5 members, and all of them are king appointees. So you can see the powers of the king extending. Actually, we say that the king is at the shop floor. You know, if you use the union language, you can say the king is on the shop floor. He actually directs, you know, who must be where and how. So it is very difficult. In 2006, there was a proposal to put in place a law that was to say that public servants should not be members of political parties. And that was meant to intimidate public servants, to say that you must draw a line, you know, between labor issues and political matters. But it's difficult to draw that line, because basically every issue is political. If you demand salary increments, that's a political issue. If people demand that there must be food, that's political. If you demand free education, it's political. So where do you draw the line that this is political, this is not political? So in short, there's been all attempts, you know, by the regime to manipulate all the structures that would make the country, you know, a civilized, democratic society. And it's not surprising that people are calling for regime change in Swaziland. Oh, you look so moral.
Give
me some hope. I came here looking for some hope.
Well, that's a good lead-up question. So, how about talking about some of the victories over the years in terms of the struggle?
No, most of them have been arrests. It's a victory, you know, when I guess history is rich, you know, to say that maybe it's inevitable that people who lead the struggles must go through some form of training. And I think there's no better college to train leaders than prison. I mean, really. If the man who inspires us, you know, spent 27 years in prison, you know, I mean, that's the way to go. And Swaziland has claimed that it doesn't have any political prisoners. So they always want to avoid putting people behind bars, or they make the world to to believe that they're not so vicious. But if you keep charging people, bringing them before the court, you allow them to apply for bail and you allow them to be free. These are prisoners. The fact that people have been out on bail since 2006 now, 16 or more have been out on bail for alleged political offenses, doesn't mean that they're not in prison. In my view, they are, because you walk with your mind, in prison, and from time to time you must go and report. They say that you must report depending on the bail conditions. Others report every Friday, others every month. But we are in prison because we are not free. If you are to leave the country, they say, if you want to go to next door South Africa or Mozambique or Maputo, you must go and report, Mr. Police, I'm going to South Africa. Therefore, you must know that I've skipped the country. That's prison. So, and they often say that there are no exiles in Swaziland. People in exile are prisoners because they've been forced out to leave the country, not because they would like to. They would like to be inside, but the conditions are not conducive for them to be in prison. So I count it as a victory that for people who are victims of this regime. But I think, what's the main victory?
There's a lot of them, I think.
Oh, yeah.
But if you want to talk about, for example, Mario being from 2008 going to prison, and then being, 16 months in prison?
Yeah, 16 months.
And then you represented him, and how long was the trial?
It was a one-day trial, half-a-day trial.
So he was acquitted after being held, but he was held for a reason. The reason was just intimidation.
Yeah.
They didn't have a case, it was
Yeah.
fabricated.
No,
So, and there have been court cases where there's been victories, right?
Yeah.
The evictions in around 2000, was it, Thulani? The
2000,
king
yeah.
appointed
Yeah.
a chief of an area where the people said,
We don't
no,
know.
we have our chiefs here, they've done things, we're loyal to them, there's no reason to appoint your brother as our chief, so they refused. And basically they were told to get out of the country, this community of 200, go, get, and they did, they were taken out to South Africa, their homes were destroyed, property damaged, their livestock confiscated. But it went through a legal process and there were victories, but it's not a big enough victory yet. The tsunami hasn't come yet. The waves are coming. The fact that Thulani's here speaking to union people in Canada who have some influence, I think that's a victory, right? There's been a lot of tragedy though in Swaziland on the ground. People have been killed, tortured, the same kind of stuff as the apartheid time. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about CEP, and since it was Workers' Day that happened.
Yeah. She has a question. Let's start.
Yes, it's a little off of what you were suggesting to speak of. Are there any women human rights activists out there? What are their potential for organizing, and what is the percentage of violence against women in Swaziland?
That's a very difficult question in the sense that, we often say that Swaziland is a cultural society. Cultural because culture continues to be the dominant factor, used by the regime to suppress the human rights. And women, through the usage of culture and tradition, don't enjoy, that status of being a full human being. They occupy minority status in law. But even though there's a Section 20 that guarantees equality, before the law, it's just on paper. In reality, women don't enjoy, full capacity before the law, and therefore they have not been so much involved, in the struggle because of that disadvantage. In my view, they are the disadvantaged minority in Swaziland because of cultural, historical backgrounds. But through the church, there's been a constant church voice through the Council of Swaziland churches that has been motivating women to stand up to defend their rights. And there has been, for a while now, women's group, one of them being Women in the Law, which has been trying to educate and empower women, to stand up and defend their rights. And again, the labor movements have been very strong, in promoting the rights of women, because within the structure they've created women's leagues and women's wings, and these are the people who have been in the forefront in the fight and defense for women's rights. The challenge, though, has been that these grassroots groups, which are able to go into the countryside to have access to women, have been dependent on government, in the fight against poverty and HIV, because women are the victims of HIV and AIDS and poverty. And people very close to those are the women's groups, in the communities. But they depend. Women in Law recently has been getting lots of money from government through the HIV program to be able to access women on the ground. So therefore, there's very little they can do, to promote women's rights, and not to be seen to be, challenging the government. Again, the political parties, have created women's wings within their structures. And the youth movement has been able to say, look, women must have a stake in the struggle for democracy. And we often say that it is difficult really to speak about the rights of women in the context of a country that doesn't respect human rights. Because you can't really speak about the rights of women if the environment is hostile to human rights generally. Women's rights are part of the human rights of all people. The example of the difficulty of pioneering a women's fight, as if it's outside of the mainstream struggle, is that one of the leading women who have been involved with a group that was, defending rights of women called Swazi, an action group against women abuse, was elected in 2008 into parliament. And people believed that she, coming from the women's movement, would be very instrumental in pushing the parliament towards laws which are friendly to women. But she was in the minority, obviously, in parliament. And this is a parliament that's hostile to women. She found herself stuck in that thing, because you cannot go there and hope to fight it from within. You can't fight the regime from within, especially if you're in the minority. So we think that we need to take the whole struggle together and say women's group, youth group, young girls which are subject to abuse because the king can pick a 16-year-old girl to be his fiancée and eventually a wife. This is the broader struggle because the king manipulates culture and religion to maintain this regime.
I just have an extra question to add to that. In the teachers' union, you say there's about 10,000 to 12,000 persons in that union. Are there, obviously there's an unbalance with the women, but is there a significant number of women that are represented in this teachers' union, or is it just men teaching?
There's a lot of women teaching.
A lot of women teaching?
Who's the president of the union?
She's speaking with some info because she was teaching.
I was teaching it, there'd be like in the primary schools.
Yeah.
It's same in Canada, it's mostly female.
Yeah.
In the primary. I was in a high school, and I think, but this was back in the 80s, I don't think it's so different. It was sort of half and half, male, female. The headmasters were always headmasters back then. I guess they're called principals now, and there are a few women. But it was, the upper administrative or the regional education offices, it was all male. But of the union, I think I'd guess close to 50%. I don't know now, really. But the head of the SNAT, the teachers union, is a woman who was actually arrested last night with the other labor leaders. And, well, arrested or detained or somewhere.
I can say that within the teachers union, they have a gender office. That somebody actually in the executive, there's a gender desk. So somebody who always ensures that there's issues of gender and women's rights are taken care of. And as she said, the current president of the teachers union, it's a massive, body, is a lady. And she's been the person, who has been the voice. I mean, it's encouraging that the main voice, one of the main voices calling for change, is this lady, and she's leading a massive teachers movement, and she's got massive support. She also is a member of the other political party. I know that she was heading the women's wing of the NNLC. So women are beginning to take up the challenge, of demanding equal status with men in Swaziland.
What was her name?
Sibongile Maseko, Sibongile.
Thank you.
Mazibu was Mazibuko.
Unfortunately, we have time for one more question because there's another people in this room. Helen.
My question was related to the legal profession and arrests, because you were talking about how obviously the people that are being arrested need defense, and you, who spoke out in some ways, and as a lawyer, you were arrested. What does that mean for you being able to continue practicing law, and how careful do lawyers need to be in their defense?
Well, I think your question with regard to the broader legal profession is fundamental. For myself, I believe that the struggle does need people from the legal profession. But I've often said that sometimes we lawyers undermine, the struggles of the people, because we tend to be too conservative sometimes. We tend to be too comfortable, and we don't want to be seen to be associating with the movement that stand up to a regime. And I think Swaziland is very unfortunate in that most of my colleagues have not been, inspired to stand up to a challenge. And I've been hoping that I would hear something from the law society in Swaziland. To date, I've heard nothing. Nothing is coming out. And that is an indication that lawyers can be very conservative, and they can be an impediment for change. But me, I think I'm inspired when I read, about how lawyers elsewhere have actually spearheaded the cause for change. I often say that it also depends who are looking at as your model. It doesn't bother me that I was arrested. It doesn't bother me that I